Listen up.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Plaw.
Welcome to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Plaw, at Andrew Plaw Tech everywhere online, and we have a pretty exciting episode for you coming today. But first, I want to cover some interesting blogs I've seen in the community. You know I got to give a shout out to Gilbert Sanchez. He has a cool post on Obsidian. It's called Taming My ADHD with Obsidian and PowerShell. That is one that I've been looking at Obsidian for a while, and it's kind of like a daunting beast. I have dabbled a little bit, pulled back, but this is a really great resource to get started with Obsidian, and also some cool ways to use PowerShell with it, which is always enjoyed around here. There's also a cool post by Sid500 about using PowerShell to calculate the total size of files. This is a pretty short one. Gives you some quick little code you can copy and paste, and highlights the awesome power of PowerShell to have one-liners, which I'm definitely going to make sure to ask Justin about some of his favorite one-liners. Also, check out the PDQ Discord, discord.gg/PDQ. We have a cool community of PowerShell folks, and don't forget to connect with the PowerShell Discord at large. It's aka.ms/PS Discord. There's a lot of great conversation that happens there, including a very special convo about plus equals, which we'll learn a little bit more about from Justin. But let's get right into it. Justin, welcome back to the podcast. This is Justin Grote. He's a data center architect kind of guy for an MSP, Microsoft MVP, and PowerShell module developer extraordinaire. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
So I saw a post yesterday from you on Spectre.Console, and I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. We got to have Justin on again. And then I messaged you shortly after, and you said yes. So here we are.
Yeah, so here I am. Sean Laurie came out with he's been working on it for a while, but he came out with a new sort of version 2.0 of this PwshSpectreConsole, which allows you to utilize this C# library called Spectre.Console, which is a really neat, basically just a really fancy ASCII character generator in the end, but allows you to do some really cool things in terms of formatting and pictures and such like that. And it's really good for building terminal user interfaces, or TUIs, as well as doing kind of formatting things. And the thing he added very recently was this really neat, really clever live preview option, where basically you can start a script block, and inside that script block, you can run this little render command, which will sort of refresh it. So you can do things where you can have live interfaces. And so he has a couple cool demos of like a file browser and that kind of thing. And I, just as a test thing, I was working on a thing with Azure Container Apps where I wanted sort of a live view of the container log, sort of a streaming log of what's happening, because container app jobs don't have support for that yet. So I made a little function to do it. And I saw that. I was like, oh, let me see if I can integrate it. And it's really neat, just the way it redraws. It's really slick. So yeah, it's a really fun thing to play with.
Yeah, that's one of my least favorite elements of TUIs, is having to like update the elements and redraw things. And this takes a lot of that out of your hands and makes it a lot simpler. So did you find it was pretty easy to start plugging in and using Spectre.Console?
Yeah, and the full credit to that is of Sean's excellent documentation. He actually came up with a couple neat little things. He uses a tool from James Brundage to export the markdown, and then he made this sort of custom Astro documentation site. And we were talking about him on the Discord with it, because it's phenomenal. Like it's beautiful. It's really well laid out, and I'm going to steal it and use it for a lot of the stuff I use. So
nice. Maybe that'll be turned into a conference talk at some point, because it's always cool to see those people with different backgrounds with maybe more of a flair for a front end design, and they bring that into the PowerShell world, and we get to benefit from it. I recently talked to Adam Driscoll, who has done sort of similar things with adding, skill sets outside of my range into something that's a little bit more approachable. But how did you hear about Spectre.Console? Have you known about it for a while and just checked out the new release, or
I had known about it? I had actually tried to make my own version of a module to sort of leverage it back when it was it wasn't really like a PowerShell thing. And one of my favorite things to always remind people about PowerShell is that PowerShell is just a C# application. It's basically just a really fancy TUI on top of C#, or on top of .NET, I should say. And so as a result, it can utilize everything that's in .NET. So some of my favorite modules to make are modules that just bring something in .NET to life and bring it in. Because somebody, a whole team at Microsoft or whoever, has put all this work into a library, and PowerShell, generally, you can basically just have to put some sort of user interface or user experience on front of it in the form of commandlets. that's basically what PwshSpectreConsole does. It's what like my Power Config module does. And so I had tried it, and so there was some things about it that just didn't quite work for me. I just played with it and just kind of threw it away. But Sean really invested and really got it going, and just had some really clever ideas for how to interface with those items. But but in the end, his commands are just interfaces to those .NET methods and calls. So when you get the objects back, they're still Spectre objects, and so you can still do all the Spectre stuff that you were doing before. And so it's really nice. And those are my favorite kind of modules, are modules that take something that's in .NET or something that may be more programmer thing and put a nice commandlet front end on it that makes it very PowerShell-y and very easy to use for people, so that they can get all this power without having to be a C# developer.
So for those who are newer to PowerShell, what is the difference between .NET and C#, and how does that affect someone using PowerShell?
Sure. So .NET is Microsoft's sort of framework for building a PowerShell, building any kind of programming thing. So .NET is sort of the engine that runs everything. And so .NET has a thing called a common language runtime, which is this intermediary layer of language that defines all the stuff that is in a programming language, like how you allocate memory, how you run methods, how you define classes, all that kind of stuff. And then on top of that are a bunch of different languages that implement that CLR. So the most popular by far is C#. But there's also VB.NET. There is F#, which is one of my personal favorites. And then PowerShell, which is sort of built on top of C# for the most part. So the nice thing about that is the way that it's built is because there is that runtime that's sort of platform agnostic. It didn't start that way with .NET Framework, but now with .NET Core, it's now platform agnostic. And so you can write it once and have it run anywhere, which is very popular. And so that's sort of the relationship, is you sort of have .NET at the very bottom, and then C# as an implementation of .NET, and then PowerShell as sort of a C# application. So they're sort of layered in that way. But the nice thing is that if you write something in even F# or VB.NET, it all compiles down to that common language runtime. So even if it's written in one of those other languages, you can still utilize it in any of the other parts of .NET. So if something's written in C# as well, you can utilize that in any other part of .NET, of which PowerShell is a part of .NET. So that's sort of the relationship between them.
Okay, so going a little further. So say we have a project in F# and we want to use it in PowerShell. How would we go about making it available?
Well, there's a couple different ways. F# is very compatible with PowerShell. And so I, in fact, have a module called F#, which allows you to write PowerShell modules with F# and include it. But basically, like, you would end up with some sort of assembly or library, or maybe it would be published to NuGet, which is the package manager for C# and those kind of things, other than PowerShell, which is very similar to the PowerShell gallery. It's basically the package manager for C#. So you would end up probably getting that package, or just the raw assemblies, which are assembly is just an assembly of the code into a nice little DLL file or something like that. And then you would be bringing that in and then being able to call those methods from PowerShell. Typically what you're doing is you're finding the type or class that you need using the bracket syntax, and then finding the thing. You've probably seen codes that use like system.web or system.net to do little things, or system.encoding to do some base64. Those are basically just the PowerShell way of making .NET calls and instantiating objects and calling methods. And you would basically be doing that. The alternative to that as well is every PowerShell commandlet, in addition to being able to be written by script, can be written in .NET. They're basically represented by a .NET class called the PSCMDlet class, or the CMDlet class. So you can, if you want to write in those languages, you can create a class that when PowerShell sees it in a PowerShell module, knows that that's a PowerShell commandlet and instantiates it. And there's a lot of benefits to doing it that way too. So there's a lot of different ways to go about that. If you're more interested about what that part looks like, Emmanuel and I did a great presentation, if I may say so myself, called Your First PowerShell Module in C#. And so if you look that up, it has a walkthrough that you can today fire up a GitHub code space for free and walk through the entire presentation the same way we did it at PSConf.eu, and check it out. So I highly recommend that if you're more interested in doing binary modules as opposed to just writing them in PowerShell. But you can, we demo in there how you can mix and match, how it looks to write in F#. For Ben, of course, we wrote it in VB.NET because that's his favorite language. So Ben Reader, shout out to VB enthusiast of the community.
That's a deep cut. I
It is.
love to see that.
That's an inside joke.
Yes. Well, that's very cool. Are there any types of projects that you see in .NET or C# or anything you think we could benefit from, or any types of projects? I mean, Spectre.Console is obviously a great example, but
yeah, I mean, there's a million of them because there's so many things that could benefit the PowerShell community, and just not enough time to write them.
yeah.
A lot of the Microsoft.extensions libraries, like configuration, which I made PowerShell config about, Power config about, logging. There could be a great PowerShell extensible logging module that could be made. There's the vast majority of just interactions with APIs where somebody's gone to all the trouble to make, like, a Meraki API in .NET or the Azure one or any of these other things where there's an API and there's this really robust library for it in C#. All you would have to do is not necessarily only all you would have to do, but to build stuff on top of that. There's a lot of really exciting things about API generation tools like Kyoto and others that are for, like, if a website publishes this open API spec, which basically describes what the API looks like, you can auto-generate code from that. And there's tools like AutoRest that do that. And having tools that could go one step further and build really nice PowerShell modules in addition to those is things I've been exploring a lot. Yeah, I mean, there's a million things that could help out PowerShell as PowerShell modules, or even integrated into PowerShell itself, that can come from that huge ecosystem of modules and of libraries that come with .NET and that people make as part of the .NET community.
Yeah, let me know if my impression is wrong here, but here's the way I kind of view it. So there are a ton of devs using .NET and other related tools that share the same CLR, and they oftentimes have a little bit more dev chops than maybe someone who's using PowerShell in the day-to-day. Not everyone, but I think by and large. So because of that, there's tons of libraries with a lot of great stuff into them that you're able to then leverage in PowerShell. But I think that, like, the marketplace or the amount of libraries that they have is definitely more substantial than what we have in the PowerShell space. Is that pretty fair to say?
Yeah, it's just simply that it's just a larger community. And so you're going to have more people that are going to come across something that's frustrating and have the ability to be like, you know what, I can fix this. I can write a library that makes this easier. And they do. And the other aspect of C# being in generally lower level than PowerShell gives you a little more power and a few more guardrails you don't have to deal with. There's a lot of things around concurrency and such like that that can be written extremely lightweight in C# that are more difficult to do in PowerShell. Just has to do with way PowerShell structure in terms of jobs and run spaces and the sort of like scaffolding that has to be around PowerShell, which helps make it easy. And so one of the big things is that exposing that information, there's not a lot that you can't do in PowerShell that you can do in C#. And there really is nothing that I can think of. It's just some things are easier than others. And it gets easier all the time. It used to be very difficult to get access to what's called a generic method in C#. But as of PowerShell 7.3, we have a really nice syntax that sort of abstracts that and makes that really simple for accessing generic methods, which exposes more power in those regards. The biggest gap right now is asynchronous programming. C# has really rallied around this sort of asynchronous programming model of async, await, and tasks. And you can interact with those. ModuleFast is an example where you can interact with those without having to write them in C#, but it's very difficult just due to the nature of how PowerShell works. And so that's always been one gap there that is a little more powerful in C# than PowerShell is. But that being said, you can still write all that fancy stuff in C# and then still access it via calls, either from PowerShell or by making commandlets that access that more, do all that call that stuff, let it do all its fancy stuff on the back end with all its parallel stuff, and then bring the information back. But still have it be very simple in PowerShell.
And you mentioned a binary module earlier, I believe, and that is just something that's written in a language that is then compiled into like a DLL. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we talked about earlier about that common language runtime, that CLR. And so, yeah, it's just something that's been written in C# or F# or VB.NET or whatever. 90% of the time it's written in C#, but there are these other ways to go about it. And when it's compiled, it's basically turned into that common language runtime and then eventually to a binary level. And so, down to almost to the assembly level. Although most of the time it doesn't go to that level, because if it did that, it has to be very OS specific. So most of the time it's just sort of at that common language runtime level so that it can then be utilized by other things. And so a binary module is, it's just a compiled version of one of those languages that can then be utilized by PowerShell. And it's either just a library that you make .NET calls directly, or it's a library that contains classes that inherit from PSCMDLit, which when PowerShell imports that DLL as a module, it looks for those classes. And if it sees them, it sees, oh, okay, this is a PowerShell module, and I need to bring that command out so that this is a command that can be seen by Git module and can be called normally.
That's one thing I love about PowerShell is the way that, you can get some value on it for now, but also it gives you the opportunity to learn so many cool skills. And I've seen a lot of people go through that route of like PowerShell's their first language, and it gives them the opportunity to write some stuff in C#, and all of a sudden they have all these new awesome skills in addition to being able to do their current job faster, but it kind of opens them up for more possibilities in the future.
Yeah, I'm testament to that. Like pretty much the only reason I got more into learning C# and learning TypeScript was because like I wanted to contribute to the VS Code extension, and I wanted to learn how. There were always things that would hit certain limits in PowerShell that I wanted to try doing a different way, and also like I got exposed to the wonderful world that is like static typing, which at first incredibly frustrated me because I was so used to PowerShell. I was like, why doesn't this just work? But it's because I got so used to all the idiomatic behavior of PowerShell, of the little things that just work, but may not work exactly the way you expect and are difficult to troubleshoot. Whereas with everything being so explicit in things like TypeScript and C#, where it really comes in handy is like, if you have 1,000 lines of code and you want to change like one little thing, to have the compiler before, and the analysis thing before you even run the code, immediately tell you, this broke, this broke, this broke, you need to fix this, you need to fix this reference. And so I just tend to have, even today, as many years as I've been doing PowerShell, if I'm writing something for PowerShell in C#, I tend to have a lot less mistakes because of all of that tooling that exists as a result of that static typing, all the IntelliSense that exists, that to the point that in PowerShell, I now pretty much type almost everything in PowerShell because of all the great IntelliSense that now exists there, thanks to a lot of the work of Martin GC94. So
you type, meaning like you set the type whenever you create a variable, like you set it to integer or whatever.
Yeah, or even more so, like I'll set it to, if you look at my code, you'll see a lot of using namespaces at the top, so I don't have to write out the whole types. So I can do things like in Azure, like if I'm working with something in Azure, like PIM, for example, I'll type something to like PIM entitlement. And when I do that, the PowerShell engine and the autocomplete engine can now know that, okay, this is supposed to be this thing always. So if I try to assign something else to it, unless it gets implicitly cast, it'll give me an error. That'll immediately solve my problem. Like, oh, I gave the wrong thing here to it, because I make stupid mistakes all the time. I think very recently, trying to remember what it was, but I did something really like I just did equals instead of -EQ, like, a rookie mistake that I still make like 15 years later, just like because I had this weird thing that was happening, it just wouldn't work. And I realized I was assigning the thing, and so it ended up always being true as opposed to comparing if it was true.
Right.
And I wasted a half hour on that. I'm like, I can't believe I made such a simple thing. But the really nice thing is, so we're all like anymore, like, I'll mistype a method name or that kind of thing. And so if you type things in PowerShell, then when you're working in VS Code, when you go to that thing and you do like a period on it, if it's typed, then PowerShell will know, and then it'll automatically give you all the properties and methods, and I can just tab complete. So not only makes it faster, I don't have to manually type it out, but it saves me from making silly typo mistakes that I spend an hour hunting down why that doesn't work and why I'm getting this method not found error.
What is your favorite small improvement that's been made to PowerShell in the past year or so?
I would say there's a couple of them. So in the last year, there's been a big focus on fixing up the back end of security, so there haven't been a lot of net new things. But the new PowerShell 7.5, which will be coming out, there's two changes, and this is going to be self-plug because one of them is a change I made. One big change that's been made that was done by Jordan Borean, but inspired by a conversation between Patrick, which was Seemingly Science, and Matthias, who is IIS Reset, all these people on the Discord. I think it came up as a question in the Fringe channel of the Discord, or maybe it started in PowerShell and it moved to Fringe, where we were talking about like this sort of conventional wisdom about why plus equals is so slow. And we know that, it's because it has to rebuild the array every single time. And so it's fine for a small amount of stuff, but once you get above like 10,000 items, it starts getting exponentially slower, having to just delete and recreate this array all the time. And so we were wondering, like, okay, well, maybe there's something in there. And so whereas that's still required, it was actually found while looking at the PowerShell code itself, which is written in C#, that there was a little bit of extra stuff that didn't have to happen as part of the process, as part of that binding process. So we talked about it, like, oh yeah, okay, well, that's interesting. That could be fixed, and just forgot about it. But then Jordan actually was like, I could actually fix this. And so he fixed it, and he went through the whole PR process and got it approved by committee and got it merged. So now when you use plus equals in PowerShell, once you're on PowerShell 7.5 or greater, you're going to get performance benefit for free. Anywhere you were using plus equals, it will be, that exponential aspect of it is vastly reduced on the order of like 90%. So plus equals has been sped up by 90% effectively. So anywhere that we used to say like, hey, don't use plus equals, it's still better to use like a list, or even better, like assign the collection to a variable so it all collects at once. But if you have to use plus equals, or it's convenient for you to do so, it's nowhere
convenient
near as it used to be. Yeah. And now it's not like you're not going to run into a problem where your script takes 100 times longer than it would have if you would have used the more, for lack of a better term, Byzantine syntax, of creating an array and using .add as opposed to plus equals. So that's great. Like, that's a great improvement. It comes for free. It doesn't, as far as we know, it doesn't come with any breaking changes. So that got merged. And so shout out to Jordan for getting that merged, and shout out to the PowerShell team and everybody involved in the committees for reviewing it, making sure it's not going to break anybody's workflows. And so the second big improvement is one that I wrote, that there's in PowerShell error records, there's been this property called recommended action. If you look in an error record, there's always been this property called recommended action. It's just a string, and it's something that could always be filled in to say, the idea was that if you have an error, depending on the error, you might want to guide a user to like a way to fix it. Like if a user gets a 403 unauthorized on a graph scope, for instance, you might want to have a recommended action that says, hey, make sure that your token has user.read.all, as an example. Like, wouldn't that be useful, as opposed to you just staring at an error as like, well, I don't know how to fix this, and start Googling it? What if PowerShell could be helpful and actually give you a recommendation for that error? So originally I made, there was this new feedback providers thing that was added in PowerShell 7.4, and I made a module to make it easy to do feedback providers. And shout out to Christian, who made a module called PS Clippy, which would do those same kind of recommendations. But I thought, well, I mean, that's nice. And I made a module that exposed that recommended action. But I thought, well, it'd be nice that people wouldn't have to seek out the module, because usually the people who need recommendations are people who are new to PowerShell. And so if they have to know to go find a module and install it and activate it, like you've already cut out probably 60% of the PowerShell audience, because a lot of them are just using things and running them, and they don't even know about those kind of things. So I decided to make a modification. It's just a UI change where when you have concise view on, if the error has a recommended action, it'll just show on a new indented line over. So you'll get your error, and then you'll get a new line that says recommended action and whatever the recommended action is. Because there was always this chicken and egg thing of nobody would fill in, module authors like me wouldn't bother filling in the recommended action because nobody ever looked at it. But nobody ever exposed the recommended action because there were never any recommended actions. So I'm trying to get over that hump to now make it so if recommended action is filled into an error record by a module author, or even just a script author, because when you do write error record, one of the options is -recommended action. So now if your users are using PowerShell 7.5 or greater, which this is sort of a long road thing, like right now it's going to be a small community, but then 7.6 will come out as long-term support, 7.2 and 7.4 will be deprecated, and in a few years, everybody will basically have this built in. So if you have a module now, like if you're doing something, if you get item and the file's not there, if somebody builds into get item a recommended action, it'll now be exposed to the user, and you'll very quickly be able to see, oh, I need to do this thing, and be able to just help guide people so that they can more easily, get used to PowerShell, solve silly mistakes, any of those kind of things. So that's a change that I made that I'm happy it's got merged. I think it's actually the first thing I've ever merged into PowerShell that went into the code and is not like a documents thing. So I'm now officially a contributor to PowerShell, like the actual PowerShell thing. And some of my code will now run billions of times. Whenever anybody in the world, whenever anybody in the world gets an error record, there's a small little check that's going to touch some code that I wrote. So I'm pretty proud of that.
That is awesome. And it sounds like if you're out there writing scripts and modules and all this kind of stuff, you should be using write error record and start using the recommended action, because as time goes on, it's going to only be more and more helpful. And I think that so many of us, type of person to be listening to a podcast like this, is interested in making PowerShell easier for people to get into and start contributing to. So any kind of recommended action or things that take place in the terminal that make your experience easier, I am a huge fan of.
Yeah, and they help you. Like if you're a module author or you're a script author, if you look at if you're collecting telemetry on your script, which is another module that I have, or otherwise, like if you're just getting complaints from users always like, hey, I get this weird error, you can very easily just add in, if you start filling in that recommended action, it's not going to be anytime soon, but over time, in a few years, those people will get this little recommended action thing coming up that explains to them how to fix it themselves. And that reduces work on you. They're not coming to you to understand how to fix it.
What's your take on Windows PowerShell versus PowerShell 7? What should people be running? What are you writing for? Because I'll share a little bit of my experience, which is I am just done with Windows PowerShell. I get it. You're resistant to change. You got Windows PowerShell in your environment. But oh my goodness, it's just so much more enjoyable to write in PowerShell 7 for PowerShell 7 for me, where I don't have to consider all this weird kind of Windows PowerShell stuff. But what's your take?
Well, for me, it kind of an analogy I always like to make is like, why don't you own an electric car? Like, why are you still throwing carbon in the atmosphere? It's like there's a lot of good reasons to still have it. Maybe you can't afford it. You're in an environment that doesn't have it. It's like I already have the car in my driveway. If I want an electric car, I got to go out. I got to buy one. I got to get it integrated. I got to make sure it's okay with my wife, aka the company. Those kind of things. And so there's a lot of good reasons. It's like, yeah, I understand. I probably should. And it probably will make my life and everyone's life better in the long run. But I may have a lot of really good reasons why they're not. And the most common one of those is environments and compliance. There's a lot of people working in government environments, working in environments, secure environments, where you're bringing in this code. And whether it's right or not, the fact that something is built into Windows makes a lot of security people and auditors just think, well, it's part of Windows, therefore it's secure, or it's already been vetted. And this other thing that you're trying to bring in, we don't know about it. And so change breeds fear, fear breeds, uncertainty. And there's good reasons for that, and there's good reasons not. I mean, there are honestly things about the PowerShell module that is on GitHub that, even though it's developed in the open and checked in compliance and reviewed, there are certain things that the Windows itself, certain scrutinies and such that it goes through for things like FIPS compliance and PCI, that PowerShell does too. But just by it not being in that box, and even if all those compliance checks never even touch PowerShell, or even look at PowerShell, that rubber stamp of, this is good for government, this is good for PCI compliance, is a big perception thing. And get that. And that's why there's such a big thing about PowerShell 7 being in box. But because of the differing support life cycles, it's also the reason like .NET Core is not in box with Windows. A lot of people don't know that, but it's not, because it doesn't have the same life cycle. So there's nothing .NET Core, not just PowerShell, that's in box with Windows because of that support cycle reason. The exception being, of course, the way that things that are like natively compiled or written to an AOT level of compilation, where they don't rely on the .NET framework as specifically. But those are kind of few and far between. So that's a long way of saying is that I feel I use PowerShell 7 90% of the time. My feeling is that if you can, generally the compromise is that you use PowerShell 7 as your command and control. Like where you may not have it, you don't install PowerShell 7 to all the servers. We don't, as a large MSP, like we don't do that. We don't like go to our customers and roll out a group policy or an Intune package that puts PowerShell 7 on everybody's computer so that we can remote it and use it. We'd like to, but we understand why that's not feasible. Instead, PowerShell 7 runs everywhere in our Azure environments. We utilize Azure Container Apps, we utilize Azure Automation, we utilize Azure Functions, we utilize PowerShell Universal, we utilize hybrid runbook workers, so that the things that we do to command and control our environments are pretty much exclusively written in PowerShell 7 now. And what they then do is they will then go out and remote to systems via PowerShell 5.1, which is pre-installed. and ready to go, execute whatever they need to do on a system in terms of gathering information or setting, and then bring that information back to PowerShell 7. But all the command and control and logic and all the heavy lifting is done by PowerShell 7. And as a result, it's faster. We can use more modules that are specifically written for PowerShell 7. It's cross-platform, so we can run on Linux, Windows, anywhere that makes sense in our environments. So that makes us more flexible in terms of our probes. Running it in containers is so much more simple than trying to run a Windows containers, which in my, Windows containers just suck. They do. They're giant, they're bloated, they're difficult to operate, they're much more difficult to test. They don't have an ecosystem around them the way Linux containers do. And so that's a huge win for us in that regard. So if you want to be working in this world where .NET Core can live and be able to get all these performance benefits for free, have your scripts run faster without you having to change anything, be able to take advantage of all these things. The vast majority of the new modules that I write, like ModuleFast, only support on PowerShell 7 Plus, because of if I have to support 5.1, there's a lot of stuff that takes the fast out of ModuleFast and adds a lot of bloat and makes it not as easy to work with. So that's sort of my take. Is PowerShell 5.1 still good, still everywhere, but it's not going anywhere, but it's also not getting new, and so nothing in it has changed for 6-7 years now. It's on mainstream support, it's on life support. There's nothing new coming to 5.1. So if you're not doing anything new, that's fine. Continue to use 5.1. But if you're going to do new things, you really should be giving PowerShell 7 a look. And also with the understanding that you don't have to put it on every single server in the environment. If you can get an Ansible server deployed in your environment, and that gets approved, or that kind of thing, it goes out and it reaches out and it does all those kind of things. So if you can get that approved, you can get a PowerShell 7 script runner approved, or you can get a container or an Azure function that takes things and does coordination, or even runs actions those ways. So that's generally my recommendation. Is I understand people are in environments where 5.1 is what they have to use for compliance, and at least what's directly on the server. So my challenge to that is, well, if you can get an Ansible server, if you have any kind of third-party software being installed in your environment, wherever that third-party software is being placed, you can place PowerShell 7 there using the same logic and the same compliance requirements as you do for any other application that's not quote-unquote built into Windows or FIPS compliant or et cetera.
So that's the argument for Windows PowerShell versus PowerShell 7. Now, taking it a similar direction, but a little bit different, how would you compare that to PowerShell ISE versus VS Code? What are the differences there?
It goes in the same batch. The thing about PowerShell ISE is because of the way that it's built, it basically runs PowerShell inside of it. Because it's a C# application, actually, I don't know if that's true. It might be a C++ application. I've never actually looked. The code's not public, so I have no idea. But the short of it being is that it is basically built so integral with PowerShell that it can do things that other tools probably never could unless they're written in the same way. So I totally understand why. And also ISE has a lot of neat things like ISE steroids. I started on ISE, and it has a lot of things going for it, in addition to the fact that it's built into servers. If I have to RDP into a random server, I'm not going to be editing what I need to do in Notepad. I'm going to use ISE because I'm going to get my IntelliSense. That being said, more and more, VS Code has such an ecosystem beyond just ISE. When you learn ISE, you learn ISE for PowerShell, and that's fine. If all you ever do in your life is PowerShell, you're happy doing that till you retire, great. But if you start wanting to branch out into doing things like C# or TypeScript, or being able to do other kind of scaffolding, or even doing things like editing Markdown, ISE can't edit Markdown, but VS Code is this ecosystem that's not just PowerShell. So if you learn VS Code, when you can do Go, when I started doing C#, I've tried Visual Studio, I've tried JetBrains, and they're nice, but there's this whole new thing of where's my command runner? How do I get to this thing? All the keyboard shortcuts are different. And if I do it in VS Code, all that's the same. The debugging is exactly the same. Like when I debug a C# script, it's just like I'm debugging a PowerShell script. It's just in that language, but my visuals and everything are all the same. So I've said this before, but to me, VS Code is the same thing as the sacred promise for PowerShell. It's like if you take the time to learn VS Code, it's one of the best investments you'll make in your career because it can take you so much further than just what you're learning for there. And you don't get that with ISE. With ISE, you get it for PowerShell, and that's it. So again, same thing. Like you don't have to install VS Code on the servers. VS Code has incredible remoting skills to be able to access it remotely, use things like GitHub code spaces, be able to SSH into systems, be able to go into a container, be able to bootstrap in a GitHub action and be inside your GitHub action as it's running to be able to troubleshoot it. Like, there's so many amazing things you can do with VS Code, and the community is so massive, as we talked about, like with the C# community, that there's so much that's available there. And also, is in that same vein I was talking about, there's nothing new coming to ISE. ISE is never going to change. So anything new that comes with PowerShell 7, any new things, that's all being done in VS Code. And more importantly, that's in the PowerShell extension for VS Code. But the really neat thing about the extension is that it's written using this thing called Language Server Protocol, which is basically a little REST API that runs locally on your computer that VS Code is talking to. It doesn't really run inside VS Code per se. It's its own little thing that has this interaction. As a result, it's not bound to VS Code. If you want to use NeoVim, if you want to write your own editor, you're not bound to VS Code if you want to get all the rich PowerShell functionality. Everything you can do in VS Code, you can do in any other editor, provided the editor provides support for the LSP and translates that to the way that it works. I know a lot of people who just use NeoVim and Vim and other variants of that. They really like the command thing. It's fast. They're already used to their keyboard strokes. That's how they came up. And they're not forced to use ISE, or they're not forced to use VS Code. They can do it that way. So that, in my opinion, is one of the biggest advantages of switching to VS Code, or at least utilizing it as sort of your driver when you're not forced to use ISE in certain environments, which a lot of people are, and I get that. But again, you can still author. I author everything in 7. Even my 5.1 scripts, I write in VS Code using PowerShell 7. And then because I get all the advantages, the speed, the tooling, and then that script can go out and it gets tested in 5.1. My pester tests run inside PowerShell 5.1 to make sure I didn't do something like a ternary operator or something that's PowerShell 7 only. But now I'm getting all those benefits, even though where that script runs is still 5.1 or God forbid 4.2, if it's a really old system.
Oh, no.
Which still happens. I mean, when you work as an MSP,
Yeah.
you still have to reach out and get telemetry from systems that still might be running 2008 and 2003. And again, for a really good business reason, that may still be a thing, even though it's a massive risk to that company. It is what it is. And you just sometimes you just don't say no, especially if they want to give you the scratch to manage it. So in the end, that's what it's about. So.
Yeah, and I like that take of it is a tool that's going to keep providing value. I've definitely said similar things on here. A lot of people start out in PowerShell, maybe some people listening to this, and that's kind of where I did. PowerShell is my first language, but when you have that familiar landing pad of VS Code, you're able to dabble in other languages a lot easier. You don't have to learn a whole new thing. You can just open up the JavaScript file in VS Code and use the same shortcuts you're used to. And I definitely encourage people to get out there and dabble, because there are some things written in TypeScript that you're not going to be able to do in PowerShell, like VS Code extensions and things like that. And it really is a great launch pad for so many other cool things you can do. And as much as I love to stand PowerShell, it is definitely worth checking out those other languages as well.
Yeah, like my original version of the PowerShell gallery mirror that I made called PwshGallery, which is still there, old.pwsh.gallery, is written in this amazing thing called Cloudflare Workers. So it's outside the Microsoft ecosystem, but Cloudflare Workers are basically like Azure functions on steroids. Like, they are incredible. Like, you can only write them in TypeScript, but they're light, they're fast. You can do anything you can do in TypeScript or Node.js. They get pushed to 140 data centers at the edge immediately. And they're dirt cheap to run. And so there's a lot of really cool things you can do with those besides what I used it for, but you can only write them in TypeScript. So just one of the many really neat examples of how those tools, can expand outwards. So.
Now, you mentioned something that I'd like to talk about, which is your collection of module installation type things. You got ModulePath, GallerySync, and ModuleFast. And I believe we talked about ModuleFast in the past. Ooh. Yeah. Little rhyme there, and that was just a way to quickly install modules, and that's kind of all it does. Is it installs modules focused on speed, maybe part of your GitHub Actions, stuff like that. But can you give me some insight into what ModulePath is, which I think is pretty cool, GallerySync and ModuleFast, and maybe how they interwork with each other a little bit?
Sure. So ModulePath is a module that I made literally yesterday, as of today being the 11th as us recording. I literally made it yesterday, based on a conversation in Discord, as well as a GitHub issue, which is, there's been this big discussion around trying to get the PowerShell, where PowerShell modules live, out of the documents folder. So it was originally put there for a few different reasons, like roaming profile reasons, etc. Again, long time. I mean, these decisions made before even Azure or Microsoft, back even when M365 was BPOS, even before that was a thing, where any of these concepts existed of the idea of maybe syncing your folder to the cloud, was about the time when these decisions were made. So when a lot of people are like, it's so stupid that modules are stored in the documents folder, why would they think that? Well, it's like, well, it was a different time when they chose it. And there were not reasons that, it made a lot of sense for the reasons that it was chosen. But for a couple different reasons, whether it's just developer laziness or difficulty configuring or too much time to test, where those paths are is pretty immutable in PowerShell. Both in PowerShell, PowerShell Git, and even PS Resource Git, the way that you get where that folder is basically hard coded into them. So if you want to use a different folder as the primary place you keep modules, you basically can't. You certainly can't in PowerShell 5.1 without doing a lot of really Byzantine kind of scripting things. But in PowerShell 7, a couple changes have been made. One big change is that there's now this thing called a PowerShell.config.json, which is used for configuring a lot of things like experimental features, that kind of thing. It's a configuration file for PowerShell. And in there is a setting called PsModulePath, where if you set that, that will change the default folder directory for your PowerShell modules. So rather than being in documents, it can be somewhere else. My preference is that in the local app data in Microsoft Windows, there's a special folder called local app data, which still sits with your profile, but can sit in a local place. And because it ends up being outside of documents, it doesn't have all the OneDrive sync problems, because OneDrive, it'll sync all your PowerShell modules, and there's all kinds of conflictions and there's all kinds of issues. And there's a whole thing where there's a lot of reasons that's not desirable to synchronize your PowerShell modules with OneDrive. It'd be like putting the installation files for Microsoft Word in documents and having those synchronized for OneDrive. There's a lot of good reasons why you don't want to do that. So you can now actually make it so that that's not your primary module folder. And so I made but you would have to know JSON. You have to go and you have to manually create the file and go in there and put this PS module path thing in. And unfortunately, there's a thing where when you put it in now, it doesn't take effect immediately. You have to restart PowerShell in order for it to take effect. That might change in the future, but as of today, that's the way it is. So I made a module that just basically makes that process easy. It's a fairly simple module. I think it's only like, actually I can look here. I got it up here. It is 107 lines long, contains 3 functions. So it's kind of an easy way to look at something that is pretty simple to make, but also supports what if and supports all that kind of stuff. But it basically contains 3 commands. It has git module path config, which if you have the JSON files already configured, you can get that information. And the most important one is set module path config, where with set module path config, you just simply give it a path where you want your modules to be. And also you can specify a -all users parameter to define whether you want that to be for all users or locally. And then once you set that, then it will automatically create the PowerShell JSON file for you if it doesn't exist and put it in there. And then all you got to do is restart PowerShell, and now your PowerShell has that as your primary module path. A big caveat to this is that as of today, PS-Git and PS Resource Git both don't honor any changes to PowerShell config JSON. So if you do install module, it will still go to that documents folder, even if you change that. Hopefully that'll change in the future. Hopefully a PR will be made to improve that in PS Resource Git. Again, PS-Git version 2 is probably never changing, so that probably will never be fixed there. But going forward, it'll probably be fixed in PS Resource Git. And plug, if you use ModuleFast, ModuleFast does respect that. So if you do this and you start installing modules with ModuleFast, ModuleFast will install them to that path, so that rather than documents. So it's just a simple function to make it easier for people to utilize this and do that set module path. Is a module that I made and recently published. So hopefully it's useful to some people. It's got a real easy, quick start where you just, at the very least, all you got to do is install the module and then just do set module path config and you're done. And it also contains a command called git module path, which will get the module, basically which one of those is correct, which utilizes a couple private methods that are in PowerShell that hopefully, again, as another PR, will get fixed, which is referenced in there. So that doesn't have to be done, because there's a couple things that probably need to be done in order for all of this to work, which is there's something that has to be fixed in PowerShell first, that we have a common way of asking PowerShell, hey, where should I be installing modules? That information should come from PowerShell, we feel. That shouldn't come from PS Resource. It shouldn't be hard-coded into PS Resource Git or hard-coded in different places. There should be a way to ask PowerShell, where should I be installing modules? And then PS Resource Git will then have the ability to, or any package manager, any package, any of the ones that are out there, we'll have a way to ask PowerShell, when I do install module, where should I be installing these modules, and be able to do it somewhere outside of documents and solve that big OneDrive issue. In addition to a lot of reasons why that part should be flexible where you install packages.
So it sounds like you have a nice little collection of solutions to packaging problems. Now,
yeah, I have my own frustrations with the way the current package managers work, and they work that way for good reasons and stable reasons. But there's a lot of reasons, like I want a declarative way installing modules, and PS Resource Git kind of has that, but it's not quite there yet. I wanted the fastest way of installing modules possible. I wanted a way that I can bootstrap and install modules without having to, I don't want to have to use a module installer to install a module to then get my module installer to install. So I made a bootstrap script that just brings in ModuleFast really quickly. I want to be able to I love other package managers where, like with I can just type .NET restore and get the packages, or I can just type, npm or pnpm install, and there's some file that will install the packages the way that I need them. Why can't we have that for PowerShell? So that's what ModuleFast can do that too. You can just type install ModuleFast, and if you have that little requires file in your thing, or even you just have a script that has a requires block at the top, it'll find all those modules and install them for you as quickly as possible. And on top of that, like PowerShell Gallery is a great package management. It has to host a lot of packages. It's built on a lot of neat technologies, but at the same time, some of those come with limitations now. Basically, any query to the PowerShell Gallery takes 400 milliseconds just due to the way the backend works. And so I made very recently, in addition to that Cloudflare worker, I liked how that worked. It was good, but it still ultimately had to go back to the PowerShell Gallery for information. So it would still be slowed down by that 400 milliseconds round trip to the PowerShell Gallery. And if you're international, even more, because PowerShell Gallery only lives in a few Azure regions. It's not as global as others. So what I ended up doing was I ended up throwing all that work that I did on that Cloudflare worker has now been basically thrown away. Although, again, it's not thrown away because I learned so much. I learned so much about package management. I learned about how the NuGet version 3 protocol works. And so I learned a lot about how that works, looked at how the package manager for C# works, the NuGet.org. And I used a tool called Sleet, which has been written to particularly build your own NuGet version 3 repositories. And I basically used Sleet to go on steroids. And I made a Azure container app, which goes out and fetches the entire PowerShell gallery, all 300,000 packages. I think it's 326 gigabytes of packages. Every package ever been published to the PowerShell gallery, fetches them all and turns them into a static NuGet version 3 repository. And it's just in an Azure storage account. And I set up the storage account to be cool storage for right now, but ultimately to be cold storage, which basically makes the storage really, really cheap. But whenever you read from those or do any actions against them, it's more expensive than if it was in hot storage. So there are certain files that get touched a bunch that are in hot storage still, but all the packages are in cold storage. And then in front of that, I put Cloudflare. I could have used the Azure CDN, but I chose Cloudflare, 1, because it's cheap, 2, because it's free basically for the use that I want to use it for. And it has more reach and has some more control over certain things that I want to do. And it has unlimited bandwidth cost. And then when you're serving up packages, that's kind of a big deal. So I've tweaked some things so that basically, because PowerShell packages don't change, because there's no way to, in a gallery, change a package. Once it's out there, then you can set the cache to basically be for like a year. That basically, once that package has been read once from my Azure storage account by Cloudflare, Cloudflare can just own it and never have to do it again. So I don't get any charges back to my storage account ever again, or maybe once a year I get a charge. And I've seen that since I pushed that a couple days ago. It only like 8% of the traffic is coming from my storage account. The rest of it's coming from Cloudflare, and that's almost all cold reads because it's brand new. As more and more people use it, more and more will be there. And so that's another thing I made. It's a little tool that reads the gallery every 5 minutes, and if there's new packages, ingests them into this new PwshSpectreConsole that I have. And that's the new backend for ModuleFast. And so now when you use ModuleFast, if you do like install module AZ and it's a cold read where basically you're in some place that has never seen that module before, all those 400 millisecond round trips to the gallery are now replaced by 30 millisecond or less round trips to this storage account from Cloudflare. And then once it's in Cloudflare, now it's local to wherever you are. So if you're in Seattle and you're next to the local Seattle Cloudflare node, now it's going to be less than 2 milliseconds anymore. And even though it's in my MVP, I get this big MVP subscription that storage account lives in. But even now, like the cost, like last time I looked, it's about like for all 326 gigabytes, even in cool storage, before you even put in cold storage, it's like 3 cents a day. And the Azure Container app that I run is still in it gets a huge free grant. So that's been basically free to run. So I have basically a copy of the PowerShell gallery with every package that's on the PowerShell gallery, serving it up through ModuleFast, and it's basically free to run. So I think that's really cool, and it's something I really love about some of the things you can do in Azure with PowerShell. And the whole thing, that all that syncing, all that stuff, all of that is all written 100% in PowerShell. It's written in PowerShell, runs in a container, and runs on a loop using PowerShell. So
sweet. I think that Microsoft recommends you internalize and don't just, for people out there that are relying on the PowerShell gallery for everything. I know you mentioned a 500 millisecond round trip. The recommendation is to internalize the modules that you're going to use in some kind of repository of your own and not rely on theirs, which is definitely a good practice. That way you can sort of vet things, and maybe if you don't have the best vetting process, it gives you the space to develop that over time and kind of make sure that things are efficient for your org. But yeah, that's a pretty extensive project there. You're definitely earning that architect title that you have there with connecting all those different pieces.
It's been a really fun side project, and I've learned a lot. And like I always say, like the two biggest problems in IT are naming things and cache invalidation. And boy, have I learned that second one, in trying to learn the best way to cache things while still, when new modules come out, make sure that gets pushed down to the client. And so, yeah, I become like a huge expert in things like e-tags and all kinds of stuff that are really clever ways to do caching and such, and basically minimize the amount of data to just make ModuleFast fast, to make it as fast as it possibly can and move as minimal amount of data between the client and the server as possible. So, yeah, I've learned a lot. It's been a fun project, and yeah, it's been really exciting. So
awesome. Well, thank you for sharing some insight into that. It makes me want to check out Cloudflare Workers a little bit, maybe dabble in some TypeScript, because I'm a huge fan of Azure Functions, which I write in PowerShell. But it sounds like Cloudflare Workers might be sort of an extension of that, or a different option.
Yeah, and the new gallery that I use doesn't use Cloudflare Workers at all. Like I've completely like that. I needed that for a reason at the time, but now I don't need it anymore. Now it just uses the native Cloudflare caching. Basically, the great thing about the NuGet version 3 specification, they were very smart about it. The way that NuGet version 3 works is it can work as just a flat file. Like you don't have to have any actual compute for it to work. With NuGet version 2, you have to run like an OData server that's probably SQL backed, which is what PowerShell Gallery runs. And you have to have like an ASP.NET server or something that can speak that. But it's all very like server-side driven. Whereas NuGet version 3, it's all just flat files. There's a JSON file that has the index of what's in it. You follow that JSON file to another JSON file, there's an index in it, and then it leads you to the packages. But there's nothing, you can just host it on a file share, or in my case, an Azure storage account. You don't have to have any compute associated with it. And the nice thing about that is, in like Azure, if you're not doing things that are compute intensive and you just need storage, it can be super, super, super cheap. And so, and the only expensive part is now updating that. But because I use Azure Container Apps, which can be used as a sort of Azure Functions without the Functions model, but that's a whole separate conversation about container apps. But by running in a container, containers are super, super cheap as well. They're like functions, where they cost like 0.000013 cents per core per second, and because you can make them really large, you can do stuff in parallel. That just keeps that runtime, do things, fan it out, get it done, shut it back down, and keep that cost low. So
it's a fun time we live in with technology now. A lot of cool options to do some really fancy stuff.
Yeah, and the lessons that I learned doing that kind of stuff, and these things that I do with Cloudflare Workers and Azure Container Apps, have improved other things in my day-to-day work. Recently, we've been building out much more of a SOC practice, and it's kind of very Microsoft Sentinel driven, and an MSSP practice. It's very Microsoft Sentinel driven. It's very Azure Lighthouse driven, and we're pretty happy with it. But there's always some gaps, like anything else. a lot of the Sentinel stuff, the connectors that Sentinel connects to ingest data, some of them are great, but some of them are kind of lacking or were great and are falling behind. An example of that is the Cisco Meraki. Right now with Cisco Meraki, you only have two supported, quote unquote, supported options. One is to just collect a ton of syslogs. And the way that they currently still have documented is a method that was deprecated as of August 31st. So the recommendation, one part of Microsoft is recommending you do this, while another part of Microsoft is saying, hey, if you do this, it's deprecated and we no longer support it, which is typical. And so the other thing is that there's a way to do it where you talk directly to the Meraki dashboard API, where you can actually get all the security events directly out of the API. Well, that's great. I don't have to build a syslog server. I don't have to teach I don't have to have my customer give me some space or figure out somewhere to place a Linux server to point those syslogs to then ingest. I can just talk to the Meraki API directly from my side. The problem is the one that they built is broken to the point that as soon as you turn it on, it hits like 800,000 times an hour to the Meraki dashboard and gets completely rate limited and duplicates certain records a million times. And so there's an issue out there. It's been open for 3 months. They're always like, hey, thanks for the feedback. And it never gets fixed. We're pretty sure the person who, it's out there on GitHub, pretty sure the person who wrote it or manages the back end part of it using what these things called codeless connectors. I'm using a lot of terminology, that doesn't mean anything to most of the audience here, but just an example of some of my work struggles. Just doesn't exist. It's just in a black hole. So to quote one of my favorite Futurama terms, it's like, well, it wasn't working. We don't have a way to do this. We don't have a way to offer this to our customers. We have contract with our customers to ingest this information. So fine, we'll build our own with blackjack and hookers. That's the quote Bender from Futurama. And so we have made a custom one that is written in PowerShell and goes out to the Meraki dashboard and does basically what the Microsoft one does, although it gathers even more information than that one does, standardizes it in this Sentinel format called ASIM, which is meant for basically normalizing data so that you can write queries once, and it doesn't matter if it's the information's from Meraki or Palo Alto or whatever. You can get a standardized query across all of them for user logins and doing threat detection for, too many logins or changes that are happening in their configurations. And so we bring all that in, and we bring it in and we ingest that information. So we originally wrote that as an Azure function, but now we've written it as an Azure container app. And the lessons that I learned doing my other projects with PowerShell Gallery is now making it so that I can do these cool things. And now we have this thing that no other MSSP has. They're going to be, oh, you got to do it this legacy deprecated way. Whereas we can say, oh, we actually have this way that we can ingest this that's supported. It uses the newest methods of log analytics ingestion. We have the ability to send stuff to the auxiliary logs, which are a new Microsoft thing in Sentinel, where the logs only cost 0.03 cents to ingest, as opposed to the $2.30 a gigabyte. So a hundredth of the cost. And as long as you're just collecting those as a just in case for an incident, and you're not constantly combing those for information, we now have capabilities that no other MSSP has. And then that goes to our salespeople and differentiates us in the marketplace. And so again, an example where just having PowerShell knowledge, just be like, that's a thing I could fix, and get involved with that company becomes a force multiplier and it increases our revenue by differentiating us from the other MSP out there who don't have an answer to the fact that, oh, well, we still have to do the old deprecated way because we have no other solution, So.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So it sounds like you're writing this Meraki stuff to log analytics and then interfacing into Sentinel from there, I guess, maybe writing some rules based on it.
Sort of. So if a crash course in Sentinel is, and I always like to break things down as they actually are, as opposed to the marketing fluff. So a crash course in Sentinel is that there's this core functionality in Azure called Azure Log Analytics. It used to be called a bunch of other stuff, it was part of Azure Monitor, etc. It's a brilliant piece of technology. Azure Log Analytics, which is also the basis of Azure Data Explorer. Azure Log Analytics it's basically a sort of flat file database that as you ingest stuff into it, it's sort of a row-based database that is very, very optimized for compressing, sharding, doing things so that when you read data, it's very well compressed, it's very well deduplicated, and reading information from it in a certain query way is very, very efficient, so that you can ingest petabytes of data and get results that if you were to put that in a SQL database would take you days to get back, even with proper indexing. it's a brilliantly engineered piece of back-end storage. And I can't rave about it enough. On top of that, the query engine that they utilize is this thing called KQL, which is the Cousteau query language. It's spelled Kusto, but Cousteau is a joke on like Jacques Cousteau. What does Jacques Cousteau do? He dives, and so it's used for deep diving data. That's where the name comes from. So Cousteau is a awesome query language, which I love because it uses this piping syntax that is almost very similar to PowerShell. Like if you look at a Cousteau query, it reads a lot like a PowerShell syntax. If you see something, it'll say like, get a table, pipe where this, and then pipe project, which is sort of the terminology for select, where you only want certain columns, or project away, which is like select exclude. Like if you know PowerShell and you use the pipeline in PowerShell a lot, KQL comes to you really fast. And so that's really nice. So that's the underlying piece there. On top of that, then, you have log analytics is what underlies all that stuff and collecting all those logs, blob, etc. What Sentinel then is Sentinel is an application that builds on top of that. And Sentinel is basically just a big collection of collectors that gives you a really nice UI for deploying these collectors and bringing the data into log analytics. And the information comes into log analytics using these things called data collection rules, which is an Azure construct that is basically sort of like a doorman or a front door. It's a way to establish a place that sets up this REST API that you can hit, that anything that has the proper key to send that telemetry can send to that, and you specify the format where you define the structure of what the log has to look like coming in there. And then you have an option to transform that. So, your front end can look like exactly how Meraki has the logs, but then your back end can be translated to that special ASIM format, and then ingest that information into log analytics. So that is all Sentinel is in a nutshell, is that's how the core engine works. And then it also provides workbooks and all these other things that are basically logic apps. But it is basically just a really nice front end to all these other Microsoft technologies with the goal of providing coordinated security response and security analytics. So they have all kinds of fancy terms that I get kind of, like hunting queries and all these very militaristic terms that really turn me off. But the SOC people really like that are based. They're just SQL queries. They're just logic apps. They're just, it makes really good marketing. But in the end, it's all pretty simple stuff. So the stuff that I'm doing is the connector part, where if you go into the Content Hub and you have these options for connectors, when you go to connect, all those connectors, they're just glorified ARM templates. And in fact, they're not even glorified. They are ARM templates. If you look at them, you'll see it. And all it does is do an ARM template deployment that puts out some stuff like a data collection rule, puts out some playbooks, maybe puts out an Azure function that helps with that collection rule, or otherwise sets up the stuff so that when you do syslog ingestion, you can send to that collection point, which then goes into log analytics. But it all uses the same technologies. Like every one of those different ones, they all are basically just feeding these collection rules to come in. And so our version of it uses a newer thing called direct DCRs, where before you had to build this data collection endpoint, which would then feed the data collection rule. It's this whole like hierarchy. Now you don't have to build that extra piece. You can just, and that extra piece costs extra. Now you don't have to build that piece. You can just have the collection as part of the data collection rule directly. So our solution deploys that out, builds the Azure function that collects the information, goes to the Meraki API, and then feeds it into that data collection point, which then drops it into Sentinel. And that's all written in PowerShell, 100%. Could it be faster in C# or whatever, but we don't need it to be. So it's pretty fast as is. And we're actually, even there, we're using a new preview thing in Azure Functions called Flex Consumption, which one big annoying thing about Azure Functions is that they're limited to 10 minutes, and you only get like one core and I think like a gig and a half of memory. So you're always advised with Azure Functions to make them small, make them fast, and use all that binding stuff to like chain them together and fan out horizontally in terms of making a bunch of instances. With Flex Consumption, you now get these instances that have either 2 CPU and 4 gigs of RAM or 4 CPU and 8 gigs of RAM. So if you have that, one of my biggest annoyances with Azure Functions is when you write something for Azure Functions, you basically write it for Azure Functions. It's not portable because you have to use all those binding terms and that kind of stuff that doesn't work outside of Azure Functions. But if you have a functions runner that's 4 CPU and 8 gigs, now suddenly you have the room to do things like run spacing and do all the parallel work inside the instance. And that stuff you can all write in PowerShell and run it just as easily on your local computer or somewhere else as you do in functions. So our thing takes advantage of that. And so it's able to break out all the parallel queries to the dashboard and then also in parallel ingest using run space, just simple run spaces, and not having to do all the fancy function stuff. So that's another thing that's really helpful. That is with the tiers. And the other nice thing about the flex consumption is now I think the runtime's up to like 6 hours too. So you have something that needs to be long running in functions. It doesn't just have to work inside 10 minutes or somehow like chain that stuff together. You can have a long running thing now that runs in functions. You just have to do it on a flex consumption plan. Now that being said, flex consumption is still preview. There's a lot of rough edges. But for our purposes, it was worth risking the preview for what we needed to do here. But then also we needed a solution that was supported. So we have a version that runs in Azure Container Apps, which basically does the same thing, but Azure Container Apps is GA supported. So we run it there.
Awesome. Well, I know a little bit more about Sentinel, but I noticed some similar things. It's always cool when you're looking at something in Azure that is just built on Azure, but they don't use the same terminology. They come up with their own names for it. It can be a little confusing. But if you look close enough, you can sort of decipher things. But I got some quick fire questions for you. But before that, I want to say thank you, Justin, for joining us. I want to say thank you out there for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, if you have some coworkers or people who you're growing with in your IT career, share the episode with them. And you know what? While you're at it, give us a like, comment, subscribe, and a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. We are everywhere, every Monday, always here. But Justin, let's get into these quick questions. First of all,
fire away.
All right, you ready for this?
I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm here.
What's one PowerShell tip every sysadmin should know?
I mean, I go with the greatest hits of that is knowing Git help, knowing Git member. You know, the best thing, it's just like the best way to learn a language is knowing how to learn a language. It's the same thing here. It's like the best tip for PowerShell is to know how to get help for PowerShell. 90% of my job is Googling stuff and more using Copilot and whatnot, because I'm not going to keep all that in my head. And I don't even know. And half the time I'll forget. Like there's so many times I'm just telling Google, especially when I'm working in other languages, I'm just like, how do I do this? I do it this way in PowerShell. How do I do it in C# and having it fixed? Or in PowerShell, how do I get this, how do I get a private method, and it's like, okay, that looks pretty good. And that's even deeper stuff than most people do. But, knowing how to use Git member and Git help and those kind of things. Like to this point, like I made a custom keyboard shortcut that if I'm on a command and I'm in the middle of typing it and I can't remember what the parameters are or anything like that, I can just hit F1 and it'll bring up in a window the help for whatever command I'm currently on, because I do it so often. I don't want to have to type Git help. I just want to hit F1 and help, tell me what this command does, but don't interrupt my flow so I can see, oh, okay, that's what this does. Yeah, 100% is no Git help and Git member. It doesn't matter if you're on PowerShell 5.1, 7, doesn't matter any version of PowerShell you're using. Knowing how to use Git help and Git member will open up all the other doors for you. So.
Yep, and a little addition, Git command can also be helpful in that little mixture of the trifecta.
Yeah, Git command dash module is one of my favorites. It says, what are the commands in this module? Like, how do I even do anything here?
Yep. Very good answer. All right, you passed the first one. What's a common mistake people make when starting with PowerShell, and how can they avoid it?
I mean, it's been a long time since I started with PowerShell, so I wouldn't know. I know that when I look at things of scripts, I think the biggest one, I think it's kind of hard to say it's a mistake because it's a learning process, but not going into the mindset of that you're making tools is that not going into the mindset that you're writing this one script that's top to bottom, go through and done. Whereas if you learn right off the bat what functions are and how to break things into smaller pieces into functions, and then having your main script call those functions, like just from a logic perspective, it makes your thing easier to read. It makes it easier to troubleshoot. It allows you to do things like mocking to make testing easier. And so I wouldn't say like, right out the gate starting, it's a mistake, but I think it's kind of a thing that you come across more and more times, that you just come across these scripts that are 10,000 line monsters that are impossible to troubleshoot, impossible to test, impossible to mock, and impossible to read. Not even knowing where to start or how the logic branches, or they end up like 12 nested things in because of some arbitrary logic. Where Code Aesthetic is a YouTube channel, which I always recommend, but they have a great video on being a never nester, which I recommend. It's not PowerShell specific, but that guy just does awesome videos anyways. I mean, for me, I'd say that's like the biggest thing. Yeah, it's hard to say because I don't.
I think that's a pretty good answer, though.
Yeah, I'm just gonna stop there because I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. You know, going through scripts and writing things in a less than efficient way is fine for your first time, but as we continue to go through this and get a little bit more familiarity, it is worth designing things in a way that is more tooling based. And that's a big transition for a lot of people. But once you get there, it's a lot more powerful with what you can do. You can create tool sets you can come back to, you can expand upon, you can use for different purposes. You can hand off to other people, and they're written in a way that's a little bit more flexible. So you don't have to rewrite a whole new script to address a slightly different issue. You can just reuse the same tool set. All right. What's a PowerShell feature or functionality that most people don't know about but should?
I mean, I would say like the autocomplete that exists in PowerShell. I think some people kind of know about it, but they don't really know to use like control space to see options. And I think especially if you're coming from another shell like Bash or etc., where it's really limited, like it is insanely powerful. And it is that same autocomplete engine that drives the IntelliSense in VS Code. Like when you get any kind of IntelliSense in VS Code, it's 90% of the time, not probably 95% of the time, literally just VS Code going to PowerShell and saying, hey, run control space, just do control space and give me the results. And especially like with the work of Martin GC94 and other people, it's insanely powerful. I mean, the one that I always love to show people that blows their minds, and you can see it at PSConf, I showed it again, is you can make a splat. If you don't know what splatting it is, it's just a different way of defining parameters. You can make a hash table and define your parameters in there. You don't have to define your parameters. And then on the next line, put the command you're splatting with, like invoke rest method at my params. And if you go back to the hash table and hit control space, it will auto-complete the splat with the available parameters of the command. Like that's just one of so many ways that you can autocomplete. You can autocomplete classes, you can autocomplete methods, everything that you can IntelliSense in VS Code, you can IntelliSense at the command line. So I think the biggest thing is not knowing about tab and control space and utilizing them to do that kind of autocomplete. I think a lot of people just come from things that's like, oh, it'll be really simple, but it won't be able to autocomplete this thing or that thing. You'd be amazed the stuff it can autocomplete, especially if the module author has added completers to their thing. Like, you know, the PowerShell, the Azure commandlets, if you do dash resource group name, do control space, it can autocomplete based on the resource groups that are in your subscription. Like it's powerful, it's super productive. Can't recommend it enough to really push the edges of it of what you can complete. And also more importantly, if you're writing scripts or if you're writing modules and tools, learning how to write completers. They can be as simple as just simply validate set, and they can get as complicated as a validate script or I argument completer. But at the very least, just doing like a validate set, making it so somebody can tab complete between different options.
It's a solid answer. I like that, and I agree. Last question. What do you enjoy most about writing PowerShell?
I think my favorite thing about writing PowerShell is that I get to go to PSConf EU. No, I'm just kidding. Only barely. I'm actually going to a wedding in a week between a couple of big PowerShell community contributors, and then I'll be riding the train from Copenhagen with other PowerShell people in PSConf EU, and I love all those guys, and I can't wait to see them. Even though I'm going to only be there for like 4 days and horribly jet lagged. That aside. Besides the wonderful community of which you are part of and everybody listening is, and thank you all for being here. My favorite thing about writing PowerShell is how fast I can get stuff done. If I want to do something, even with C# or as good as I get with them, like if I want to get something done, I got to write all this stuff. And more importantly, like I got to figure out how to test it. I got to like figure out how to play with it. The ability to just play with stuff. I'm working with a new API. I'm writing a thing like set ModulePath config yesterday that I can just open it up and start writing, test the thing, test it over. Like the inner loop process of PowerShell is like nothing else. Just to be able to run a command, test it, tweak it, change a little bit here, see if it worked. Oh, that didn't work, adjust it. Any other language, it's like, okay, I'm probably writing tests over here. I got to write the scaffolding. I got to run the test. Okay, I got to rewrite the test, go back here, see if that worked. Oh, I got to mock this thing because I can't do it. Just being able to bang something out and have something that's working and functional. I'm more productive in PowerShell than any other language, at least for getting started. Once stuff starts getting like 10,000, 15,000 lines, I start begging for some kind of static analysis where if I want to change something in my PowerShell script, I really hope I'm not breaking something else, because the only help I have are the pester tests that I've written. Everything else is going to be broken at runtime and scare me. So that part I don't like so much. But when it comes to just hammering something new out or trying out or playing with an API or trying to come up with a new idea, there's nothing faster than PowerShell in everything I've ever used.
Speed is something that is pretty important to you based on some of your projects as well. So,
well, and
cool
in work
to
too, is like if there's a problem that has to be solved, the CrowdStrike thing being a huge one. When CrowdStrike became a thing, when we realized one of the things is like, well, it turns out if you just reboot something enough times, you can fix it. I, faster than anybody else in our company, came up with a script that would go out, look for virtual machines that were in a certain agent state, and just reboot them, and then watch, and it would find all of them and just keep rebooting them every 5 minutes, and probably cut our resolution, because in our case, we were an MSP. We had everybody else's CrowdStrike problem multiplied by 100 because we had to fix it to all of our customers. And so just being able to have that and do that probably saved hundreds, if not thousands of hours of our army of people going around who had to fix stuff manually, just in a PowerShell that I hammered out, that if I would have had to write that in C# or write it in something else and trying to call the C# libraries and all that kind of stuff, people would have just fixed it by the time I had something that would have been functional the next day.
When you write stuff like that, where it's doing a bunch of stuff, are you writing the output to log analytics or just kind of making sure it does its thing?
In that case, it was just sort of just doing its thing. I mean, again, when we were just on the cusp, it was literally just running in a virtual machine with the verbose output, watching it loop, and just making sure it wasn't going to break anything terrible. And then it was reading from a flat file that was on Azure File Share that we had team that could just go in and put subscriptions and stuff in there, where that one was that, hey, we need this thing working on this thing. Going through and rebooting a bunch of virtual machines, in a very short time is a very risky thing. So if the logic in the script is wrong, now I'm rebooting all the servers and all of our customers willy-nilly and making things worse. But luckily, we were pretty confident in the logic, at least from that kind of base level. The thing was that the risk was worth, the fact, well, everything's down anyways, so the risk is worth it. But and of course, we got approval before we did it. We're like, hey, we have this thing that can probably cut down the work. It is a risk. Be aware of this, if there's something wrong with the script. But yeah, that was a big one. And so that's just an example of like having that kind of speed where it can matter, and it can save having the speed to be able to get something out there, or even just code something up to see if something's viable. Somebody has an idea like, I wonder if this would work. It's like, just at least get it on a rough level before we make it really robust, is invaluable. And, whereas it's just like, well, maybe this would work. We got to send it to a dev for 2 weeks. And maybe it was like, well, let me just hammer on it for an hour and see if I can at least get something close. That's how the Meraki dashboard thing I was talking about. I was like, hey, these connectors suck. And I'm just like, well, what if I just tried to pull this information separate? Like, how hard could it be? And then it turns out like, okay, it's not that bad, but then we got to write a bunch of validation stuff so it doesn't do the same things the Microsoft solution does. But in the end, we ended up coming up with something. So
awesome. Well, Justin, thank you so much for joining me today. If people want to connect with you, where can they find you on the World Wide Web?
The easiest way is Twitter and Discord. On Twitter, I'm Justin W. Grote, and on Discord, I'm Justin Grote. And those are the big. That's as far as I know, that's where the heat pulse of the community is at. I know there's a growing community on LinkedIn as well, and there's a pretty decent group on Mastodon. But where I spend my time are basically those two places, as well as the GitHub issues for various things. So that's where you can find me.
Awesome, Justin. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone out there, for listening. Walk safe, drive safe, do whatever you're doing, but do it safely. And we'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.